1.5 Ratification of the U.S. Constitution. So where we left off, they were calling the Constitutional Convention. This is where they were hammering out all, the compromises for the Constitution, hence the name. So we're all coming together to create this, one plan, and everyone's got different ideas, so we're going to have a whole lot of compromises. And that's what a good chunk of this topic's about. For example, the Virginia Plan. This called for 3 branches of government, an executive, judiciary, and a bicameral legislative. So this bicameral legislature means it has 2 houses. And in the Virginia Plan, people would elect those for the lower house, and the people in the lower house would then elect those for the higher house. Also in this plan were limits for the branches as well as the national government, superseding the states in, government. Smaller states did not exactly share this idea. For example, the New Jersey Plan had states with a large amount of sovereignty and a national government with very limited abilities and powers. Especially with this whole deal of representation, small states feared outnumbering by large states with population-wise, versus large states' argument that we have more people, we should have more of a voice, and it was different back and forth. On page 33, there's a table that details a whole lot of the compromises, so if you need to look for a quick glance to review, I would suggest going there, but we'll end up going through all of them in this video. So I was talking about, representation was a very big deal. How were states and people supposed to be represented? More populated states were we should have a larger voice because we have a larger amount of people. But smaller states wanted to retain that equality. And so we ended up with the Great Compromise. Here's where we get our Congress from, a 2-house Congress with a House of Representatives based on the amount of people, the population of a state, and the Senate with 2 people from each state, no matter the size. And because the House was based on population, we had to reach another compromise. This mostly has to do with southern states versus northern states. Enslaved people did not have the right to vote at this time, and so depending on if they were counted as a part of the population, voters had more or less sway. And so they came to the 3/5 compromise. So for states with enslaved people, 3 out of 5 enslaved people were counted when determining representation in the House. There were 2 more questions surrounding enslaved people underneath the Constitution, and those were, can the federal government regulate slavery, and are non-slave states required to extradite escaped slaves? So in response to the first question, Congress was prohibited from stopping international slave trade for 20 years after the ratification of the Constitution. And in response to the second question, there ended up being an extradition clause that addressed how states would deal with that. Page 34, they give you another table full of compromises. A summary of those, I would highly recommend looking at that if you're looking at a quick review of the subject. Another compromise was on how do we elect the president? Some people were Congress should elect them. And others were the people should elect them. And so the compromise here was the Electoral College. So under this, states could decide how their electors were chosen. The numbers of electors matched the amount of delegates or representatives they had in Congress, and people would be voting for the electors. This is an example of how we have an elite model of democracy in our government. Of course, though, there were other compromises, especially to figure out what powers the federal government would have versus the states would have. Also, what types of laws can Congress make? The Commerce Compromise. This allowed the government to have a tariff on imports, but not exports. So the federal government could regulate trade. Now, I wonder what our foundational document is. Maybe the Constitution of the United States? Exactly that. Article 1 talks about Congress. House members elected every 2 years. Senators were elected by state legislators, but that changed with the 17th Amendment, making the House the more democratic institution. Article 2 talks about the president and the executive office, commander-in-chief, head of state. Article 3 talks about national courts. They only actually mention one court, the Supreme Court, but they said that Congress can make inferior courts. Federal courts deal with federal law, government officials, and state-to-state stuff. Article 4 talks about states and their relations, good full faith and credit clause, stuff like that. Article 5 talks about amendments, which we'll get to in a second. Article 6 talks about national supremacy, so all states have to follow the Constitution. And finally, Article 7 talks about the ratification process. Okay, so the amendment process, Article 5. First, you need a proposal from 2/3 of the House and Senate, or with a 2/3 vote at a convention that's initiated by the states but called by Congress. Stage 2 is the ratification, and this is where 3/4 of the state legislators vote, or 3/4 of the states ratify at a ratifying convention. All proposals have passed through Congress, and all of them but to the 21st Amendment was ratified through the conventions. So this gives a balance between these strict and really difficult way to change the law, and it gives it a flexibility. But it still takes a lot of power to change the Constitution. Okay, so the constitutional system. So there's democracy and elections, but it's a representative republic in that there are limits to the government, and you can't change things with a snap of your finger. National and state governments are still sharing power, although national supremacy does give the national government the upper hand. And the necessary and proper clause given to Congress gives even more flexibility. Some unforeseen issues include that of how fast and large the U.S. population has grown. This has led to some unequal representation in the electoral college and electing process, with populations and electoral vote influence. So after we finished our final draft of the Constitution, it was sent out to the states for ratification. Basically yes, let's go, we're going to do this. And it would go into effect once the 9th state signed it. 3 of the framers didn't sign it, though, including George Mason. He was concerned about people's rights, hence we have a Bill of Rights, because others agreed with him. They felt that this was necessary for personal rights mostly, especially those that they had won through this revolution, or won back, I guess I could say. Others, like James Madison, were this really isn't necessary. It's not actually going to stop anything. And he's if we list them, then what about the ones we don't list and the government takes away? But eventually, James Madison was persuaded because we now have a Bill of Rights. I'm going to list them really quick off this graph on page 41. First Amendment, freedoms of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. Second Amendment, right to bear arms. Third Amendment, no quartering of troops. Fourth Amendment, no unreasonable searches or seizures. Fifth Amendment, indictment, double jeopardy, protection against self-incrimination, due process. Sixth Amendment, speedy and public trial. Right to defense counsel, that stuff. Seventh Amendment, lawsuits and juries. Eighth Amendment, no cruel or unusual punishments or excessive fines and bail. Ninth Amendment, listing rights in the Constitution doesn't deny others. And 10th Amendment, delegated and reserved powers. So yes, the Constitution was written however many years ago, but it still impacts us today. It's literally the law. So let's discuss some modern debates. So first, individual rights in September 11th. Big idea. Governmental laws and policies balancing order and liberty are based on the U.S. Constitution and have been interpreted differently over time. That was highlighted in your book. I would maybe know that. So, after the tragedy of 9/11, some new and different measures were put into place, like the USA Patriot Act, uniting and strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism, is what it stands for. This dealt with intelligence gathering and the sharing of that information between government agencies. And it gave greater leeway to tapping phones, among other things. But then people began to question its constitutionality, especially in regards to the right to privacy. So eventually Congress had the USA Freedom Act, which upheld certain parts of it, but took out all the collection of phone and internet data that didn't prove to be very necessary to preventing terrorist attacks. Finally, education, national goals, state management. So up until the 1960s, schools were largely up to the states. But racial desegregation of schools and the Cold War had the federal government getting more interested in it. 3 bolded terms for you here. No Child Left Behind Act included improvements in teaching methods, testing as a way to measure progress, and sanctions for underperforming schools, but it received a lot of criticism because people felt that they were unrealistic standards. Race to the Top offered incentives rather than sanctions, and under the Every Student Succeeds Act, states can set their own standards as long as they uphold protections for disadvantaged students, all under federal approval. Thank you for watching. I hope this helped. I have other videos.